Resident Evil 2 attempts to iterate on the horror introduced by the first game in the series, a game that captured hundreds of thousands of players, that terrified gamers everywhere, that represented a massive step for the horror genre on the PlayStation 1. Resident Evil 2 wanted everything that the first game had and more, and it succeeds at all of those things, just in a wildly different way. The first and second Resident Evil game could not be more different entries in the same series. While the gameplay remains much the same, the environment is wildly different, the characters are different, and most importantly, the fear is different. The bones of the game are the same, but the skin and the soul feels new and fresh, fundamentally the same as two humans, but entirely different people. And this is largely what leads to Resident Evil 2's success, that it follows up on the first game by giving people more of what they loved and a lot of what they didn't know they wanted. Many areas have been upgraded. The story has a wild amount of depth when compared to the first game, introducing more characters, branching paths for the different scenarios in the game, and subtlety and complexity to the narrative. While Resident Evil 2 doesn't propel the series to Shakespearean heights, it does improve upon the first game's often clunky and awkward story, and in doing so, it also retains the things that made the first game special. Resident Evil 2 still feels like a B horror movie in most regards, but a B horror movie with a larger world and more fleshed out characters. The gameplay has been upgraded, introducing new options for weapons, more monsters, and a few dynamic systems into the Resident Evil world. Being the first sequel in the series, though, it bears the responsibility that the moniker carries with it. The large stamped number 2 rushes through the player's mind as they pick up the game case. As they boot up the product for the first time, anticipation rises in their veins and expectation takes hold. 2. Does this game have 2 times the amount of enemies, 2 times the amount of story, 2 times the amount of Rebecca Chambers? But as they say, heavy is the head that wears the crown. Does Resident Evil 2 bear the responsibility of a sequel? This is the question that I'll try to answer today as I dive into Resident Evil 2. I'll be talking about gameplay, story, and everything in between. If you haven't seen my previous video on Resident Evil 1, I would highly recommend checking that out. While spoilers aren't that important yet, this series is meant to represent each era of the Resident Evil franchise, and it's not mandatory, but watching that video would provide ample context for this one. Also, if you enjoy the video, consider liking and subscribing to the channel as it really helps me out. 60% of you are not currently subscribers to the channel, which means that 60% of you are my mortal enemies, and all that can be ended with the click of a button. Spoilers for Resident Evil 2. Hey Dad, it's me, your favorite son, and today I'd like to talk about Resident Evil 2. With the release of Resident Evil 1, Capcom had found themselves a smash hit. It was the best-selling PlayStation game of the time, and even the ports were bringing in considerable players. It was clear that the game needed a sequel, but what that sequel would look like wasn't always as clear. Producer Yoshiki Okamoto wanted the series to spawn many entries that were self-contained. He saw it as something like Gundam or James Bond, where you weren't as attached to the overarching story as you were the one right in front of you. Okamoto also recognized the importance of creating a sequel to a successful first outing. If we successfully launch a title like Biohazard by chance, but then messed up on 2, we can't be trusted as a company. If you let your ace pitcher take the mound 2 days after his last, and he ends up injuring his shoulder, you'll still let him pitch as your ace, whether it's 4 or 5 days after his last, and he'll definitely get a win. That's the sort of usage I want to see. The team developing Resident Evil 2 recognized that a sequel had a responsibility to not only provide more of what fans wanted, but also to iterate and expound upon the things that fans loved in the first place. Shinji Mikami, the director of the first game, would return to develop Resident Evil 2, but he wasn't returning to his familiar director's chair, but rather the role of producer. Hideki Kamiya would end up taking on the director's role in the second game. Kamiya didn't have a lot of experience in game development up to this point. His first gig was as the system planner on Resident Evil 1. His second role was working on a game called Arthur 2 Astaroth no Nazomakai Mura, Incredible Tunes, an entry in the Incredible Machine series. Directing Resident Evil 3 was his third gig, and frankly, it was his golden opportunity to step up to the plate and show Capcom what he could do. Kamiya would have a prolific career across video games after this, directing the first Devil May Cry game, Beautiful Joe, Okami, Bayonetta, the list goes on, but this was just the beginning. In the beginning of development, Mikami and Kamiya would disagree on many different aspects of the game. This would lead to other members of the team being unsure who they should take orders from. Mikami eventually realized his role on this new game and tried to take a step back. He would check in on production every month or so to ensure things were going along smoothly, but left Kamiya and the team to their own devices. This eventually led to Mikami checking in one day to realize that the game was not nearly up to his standards. I left the work of 1.5 to the young staff, but there were many problems. The ingredients were good to a certain extent, so it was just a matter of cooking. Even if it wasn't good, I thought it would probably be fixed in 3 months. However, when I opened the lid, I found the dish's level of saltiness to be lacking, so we decided to remake it from scratch. You see, the version of the game that the team was working on up to this point would be referred to later as Resident Evil 1.5. It wasn't billed this way, it was actually revealed and marketed as Resident Evil 2, because that's what it was supposed to be. But when the game was around 60 to 80% complete, Mikami and the team realized it just wasn't where it needed to be, and he ordered the entire thing scrapped to be built back from the ground up. This version of the game is now known as Resident Evil 1.5, and many things changed in remaking the project. While Resident Evil 2 introduces 2 new characters in that of Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield, the original version of the game had a character named Elza Walker instead of Claire. Elza was a motorcycle riding student heading into Raccoon City for her first day at university. She would end up crashing into the police department after realizing that the city was overrun and would hole up inside. The story of the game would follow similar beats but would include more characters that were eventually cut. In this version of Resident Evil 2, Umbrella was shut down for its illegal research that was uncovered in the first game. Obviously, Resident Evil 1.5 was scrapped, and the only thing that people had for some time was screenshots and short presentations from promotional material. That was until 2013, when a development build of the game leaked. If you're interested, that build is still out there and is still playable today, though this build was never finished, so it's not the full game. It's a surprisingly deep subject on its own because supposedly there's a rumor of another build out there from far later in development that just never surfaced. Regardless, after restarting development, the game was delayed and it was crafted into the Resident Evil 2 that we'll talk about today. Resident Evil 2 was officially released on January 21st, 1999 in North America, January 29th, 1999 in Japan, and April 29th, 1999 in the PAL region, all for the Sony PlayStation 1. Now, it wouldn't be a video on a Resident Evil game if I didn't first talk about the lengthy ports and various versions of this game. There's a fantastic write-up on the website Strategy Wiki that lists all of the versions and their differences just in case you're interested. The original PlayStation version is the vanilla version of the game. It's the most true to spirit, but it also doesn't have any of the added features of the later entries. Just like the first game shortly after its release, Resident Evil was re-released with a DualShock version. It was released in August of 1998, just a few months after the initial release of Resident Evil 2. This, of course, included DualShock functionality, but also a newly introduced Rookie mode that made the game a bit easier, and an Extreme Battle mode. Despite these new features, the graphics stayed mostly the same. The Nintendo 64 version of the game was released in November of 1999 and is one of the strangest versions of Resident Evil 2. It contained adjustable gore levels, a randomizer, extra outfits for characters. The most impressive part of this version of the game, though, is that Resident Evil 2 originally came on 2 discs, and this version condensed that into 1 cartridge, which is pretty impressive. That does mean that the FMVs had to be pretty heavily compressed, though, so they don't look great. There was some extra story content added to this version of the game as well, called the X-Files, but we'll talk about those later. The Dreamcast version was released in December of 1999 and didn't add anything particularly notable outside of being able to view your health status on a VMU. The Windows 9X version of the game was released in February of 1999 and contained all of the added features from the DualShock version, but also included a gallery mode with unlockable art and character models. The models and graphics were heavily upgraded in this version, so it does look a bit nicer on that front. The GameCube version of the game was released in January of 2003. It was based on the DualShock version of the game and has all of the extra content included in that release. But the graphics have been improved, the FMV sequences run at a higher frame rate, and models are particularly smooth. There was technically one more version of the original game called the Game.com version, which wasn't really a port as much as it was a demake. It was a shorter and simpler version of the game, as if it was ported to a Game Boy Advance or something. It also only contained Leon's side of the story, with a Claire version being planned, but it was cancelled before it could be completed. And then, of course, in 2019, Resident Evil 2 was fully remade from the ground up for PlayStation 4, Windows, and Xbox One. I will talk about this version in a later section of the video because it's so drastically different from the original version of the game that it deserves its own section. But which version of the game did I mainly play for this video? I tried out most of the ports that I listed above just to see how they played and felt. I ended up liking the GameCube version the most, and the nice thing about the GameCube version is that a graphical overhaul has been created by some dedicated fans called the Seamless HD project. This makes the game look a lot more smooth if you like that kind of thing. I generally would have kept the original graphics, but I figured it would make for better footage for use in this video. Before we talk about the game itself, we need to talk about routes. In Resident Evil 1, you could play the game two ways. You could play as Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine. Playing through with either of these characters led to effectively the same results as far as the story was concerned. The same outcome was reached, but the way you reached it was a little different. In Jill's story, you were accompanied by Barry, and in Chris's story, you were accompanied by Rebecca Chambers. While this basic structure is still true for Resident Evil 2, it expands upon this idea and takes it a bit further. When starting the game, we have the option of either playing Claire at the beginning or Leon, but this choice will set us down a path. This choice is between the two A scenarios in the game. We either start out by playing Leon A or Claire A. After playing this route through, we can then play through the opposite character's B scenario. This shows us what was happening to the other character while we were killing zombies and trying to escape the police station. For example, if we play Leon's A scenario first, then we will play Claire's B scenario second and complete the story in the process. Of course, once you're done with these, you can play back through Claire's A scenario and then Leon's B scenario to see a bit of a difference in the story. It is honestly a bit confusing, but there's effectively two routes to take, playing Leon's side first or Claire's side first. We'll talk about canonicity and all of that stuff later because it's complicated and honestly not really important, but I first played Leon A and then Claire B. Most people maintain that Claire A and then Leon B is the definitive version of the game, and after I go through the main story, we can talk about why, but let's first talk about the game and the progression of its narrative. Resident Evil 2 begins as we see a recap of the events that occurred in the first game. We're told that the case around the mansion and the outbreak there was closed, that the STARS members, that's Special Tactics and Rescue Service, completed the job. But this isn't entirely true because Umbrella is still experimenting to this day. We then see one of the new protagonists, Leon, as he heads into Raccoon City for his first day on the job. Leon is a newly hired police officer for the RPD. The streets of Raccoon City are quiet as Leon rolls into town, and shortly after his entrance, he finds a body lying in the center of the street. We then see a strange monster nearby at a truck stop and a driver being bitten. Leon is then swarmed by zombies, trying to take every action he can before firing his weapon, first day on the job and all. But once the seal is broken, Leon starts emptying his magazine. He sees a nearby door open and an uninfected woman inside. He saves her and they both take a cruiser into the city to try and find the solace of the police station. On the drive over, we learn that Claire is in search of her brother, Chris Redfield, one of the STARS members that we played in the first game. Leon gives Claire a gun to protect herself before the two are startled by a zombie in the back seat. This leads to them crashing into a pole down the road before the bitten truck driver crashes his vehicle into theirs. This causes a massive explosion and separates the two characters. This is where we begin Leon's story, stranded on the streets of Raccoon City, weaving through the alleys in an attempt to find the police department. In this introduction sequence, we see the first of many massive improvements to the Resident Evil series. First of all, in lieu of live-action cutscenes, Capcom has created full CG FMVs for this entry. While they clearly look very of their time, they are extremely unique and add a distinct style to this entry. The animations and exaggerated movements give the game a unique action feel. While the first game's live-action scenes generated a B-movie horror, these sequences wind up as an aura of tension. The first game had CG sequences as well, but they were used far more sparingly than in Resident Evil 2. The second feature that Resident Evil 2 introduces is the aspect of a widened world. We start in the streets of Raccoon City, and we get to see what's become of this place. The scope of the world is broadened, no longer just centralized to a mansion and an underground section, but a city. And if there's a city, this means there's a world. Leon quickly pushes through the streets and manages to find himself inside of Kendo's gun store. Kendo himself is aiming a shotgun at his face. He lowers the weapon once he realizes that Leon hasn't been turned. We can pick up some ammo from the gun shop, but the owner is quickly overcome by the outside horde. If we are quick enough, we can actually pick up his shotgun before leaving, providing us with an early game power boost that's quite substantial. Leon exits through the back door, and we're once again thrust into the alleys of Raccoon City, forced to find our way through the hordes of monsters. Just like the first game in the series, Resident Evil 2 has some absolutely gorgeous backgrounds. All of the backgrounds are pre-rendered and smooth. They're incredibly detailed, and while some of the police station ends up a bit more simple, the streets of Raccoon City are some of the best environments in the game. The fake watch ads on the billboards, the back alleys littered with trash and lost items, the narrow, graffiti-filled stairways. It all sets a perfect tone for the upcoming story. This place, the city, is not somewhere that we want to be. We need to get somewhere safer, a stronghold, a representation of protection, the police station. But just like the first game, this supposed bastion of hope will become a house of terror before long. Leon finally arrives at the police station to find this place derelict. The expected force of officers ready to fight off the leagues of undead are nowhere to be found. One officer does remain, one that's already wounded. Martin Branagh apologizes that they couldn't have a welcome party for him, and he also tells Leon about Chris, Jill, Rebecca, and Barry, the 4 STARS members that risked their lives to tell people about what happened at the mansion. He suspects that Umbrella is behind this outbreak as well. He gives Leon a key card and tells him not to worry about him, to rescue anyone that he can, to save himself. At this point, we can start exploring the police station, trying to uncover its mysteries and find a safe way out of this place. So, how does Resident Evil 2 play? Resident Evil 2, just like the first game in the series, uses tank controls. We aim our character in a direction before moving forward, making adjustments with the D-pad on the way. We aim weapons and fire them, either adjusting up or down with the D-pad to aim at enemies above or below. Just like its predecessor, Resident Evil 2 is a game about resource management. It isn't quite an inventory management simulator like I mentioned Resident Evil felt like, but it is quite heavy on dealing with inventory space and items. Each item takes up a space in our inventory, a valuable space. We always have the choice between offense and defense. Weapons represent aggression, the power to fell your enemies in battle, and killing enemies quick enough means that we don't get hurt at all. Healing items represent protection, the ability to heal yourself and prevent death and the loss of progress. We carry the same system from the previous title for saving. We can only save if we have an ink ribbon in our inventory. Not only does this mean that saving is finite, and we can only save as many times as we have an ink ribbon, but it also means that being able to save takes up a slot in our inventory. Combat and exploration have a similar feeling to Resident Evil 1 as well. Each room presents us with enemies that give us a choice to entirely avoid them or to take them out. Taking out the zombies that have infested the police station means that this area will be safer to travel through later, but we have to spend ammunition to do so, paying with the currency of safety as well. It's also worth noting that dodging enemies is far less possible in this entry than it was in the first game. A lot of the corridors are far more narrow in the station than they were in the mansion, and the zombies are more numerous, making it a bit more difficult to just sneak past them. And at the end of the day, Resident Evil 2 is still a horror game in a horror series. At the base level, Resident Evil 2 is still scary. We still fight against horrific creatures, and pushing ourselves to run from these things still rises terror in the heart. But Resident Evil 2 deals with a different sort of fear. This comes from the change in directors. When speaking about a specific scene later in the game, Mikami said this: "It's a terror of realism and absurdity, so if I were to do it, it might be a bit plain. I insisted on adding a scene while playing where the tyrant bursts through the wall, but the details of this scene before and after weren't quite as I'd imagined. If I put too much of myself into it though, the subjective taste of the game's creators would be lost. Subjectivity comes into play one way or another after all. I think that's what determines the degree of interest." Kamiya's idea of horror compared to Mikami's is a bit more based in excess. It's about being chased, it's about facing hordes, it's about the insurmountable odds that you're up against. Mikami's horror, Resident Evil 1, was the opposite. What happens when you're starved of resources? When you have to survive on your own? What happens when you exhaust all of your bullets? You don't get out, you still have to face the terrors and survive. In more ways than not, Resident Evil 1 and 2 overlap. They both set themselves in a central location, an old building that eventually lays cover for a secret underground lab. But the pieces where they don't overlap, the differences between the two projects, is what makes Resident Evil 2 so interesting. The second entry in the Resident Evil series also returns the structure of puzzles. Most of our time here is spent trying to get keys, items, and objects that will unlock new areas and possibly get us the hell out of this place. In Leon's side of the story, our main goal is to complete puzzles to collect various chess-themed plugs in the interest of unlocking a door to the sewers. It's also worth noting that this time around, weapons are upgradable. By completing various puzzles in the game, we can get weapon upgrades and combine them with the weapons they are meant for. Some will increase magazine size, damage, etc. It's a fantastic upgrade and presents more rewards for the player to work towards instead of just more healing items or ammunition, permanent upgrades that affect our ability to fight. Leon makes his way through the station, battling his would-be co-workers as they've now all turned. Pretty early on, Leon will run into a new enemy type, the Licker. These mutated beasts crawl on 4 legs, launch at the player, and use their tongues to attack. They luckily rely on their hearing to track their enemies, so if we walk slow, we can potentially avoid them altogether. They are incredibly strong and require a ton of shots to kill. They function quite similarly to the hunters from Resident Evil 1, except they don't present a massive oppressive change in gameplay and structure. They are here from almost the beginning. This communicates to the player that Resident Evil 2 will be far more intense than the first entry in the series. Things will not be as smooth this time around. More enemies, more difficult foes. Survival is a requirement. As we make our way through the police department, we can find the STARS office, the room where the Special Tactics and Rescue Service did their work. We can find Chris's diary in here where he notes the events after the mansion incident. Chris began trying to take down Umbrella by telling the right people, but nobody would listen to him. As he began to see the newest outbreak start, he realized that he had to do something. Jill and Barry decided to head to Umbrella HQ with him to deal with the issues themselves, keeping this information from Claire to protect her. Claire shows up at the station and Leon gives her the bad news, that her brother isn't here. He then tells her that they need to get out of this place as quickly as possible. The goal now is to look for survivors and then split. Much of the next hour of the game is spent running around the station and solving puzzles. In Resident Evil 1, we had to collect different keys marked with a sword, armor, or shield. These keys would unlock the corresponding doors that matched their symbols. In Resident Evil 2, these keys are now matched with shapes, a diamond key, a club key, a heart key, etc. Getting these keys will allow us entry into other areas of the station, and in most areas of the station we'll be solving puzzles to get chess piece plugs as rewards and eventually gain access to the underground section of the station. One thing that Resident Evil improves greatly is the way that its story is delivered to the player. In the first game, we did have notes and memos that gave us information, but most of these were pretty broken and simple. Oftentimes, they were incomplete or poorly translated. And even if they weren't, the information wasn't exactly groundbreaking. Most of the notes boiled down to, "We got attacked by zombies, oh no." But in Resident Evil 2, not only is the translation of the dialogue in the memos much better, the notes tell a story that is much more interesting. Certain notes that we find from the secretary at the station will tell us about the police chief. Brian Irons, the chief, was extremely concerned with the statues and art in the building. He was so concerned that he would lash out at anyone that touched the pieces. This is most likely because the art was concealing puzzles that would lead anyone who figured them out into the secret areas of the station. It's a little touch that just adds a bit of depth to the game. It honestly feels like the explanation of the mansion's construction in the Resident Evil 1 remake. And a lot of the story follows a similar pattern. Most of the conversations just feel a lot more important. The characters are a bit less one-dimensional, and even though the story is pretty straightforward, it feels like we get a lot more from it. There's little remnants of character and world, like the note we find to Leon from his would-be co-workers at the RPD. They were wishing him well and were excited to work with him, which makes it all the more difficult to fire shots into these undead. We'll actually head back into the office and see that Branagh has fully turned, and we have to put him down. Eventually, Leon makes it to the back roof of the station and finds that a helicopter has crashed into the side of the building. We can put out the fire on it to gain access to another room that it was blocking. Once we get the heart key, we can gain access to another wing of the station, which has a staircase that leads to an underground section. In the parking lot, we meet a woman in a red dress. She tells Leon that her name is Ada Wong and that she's looking for a reporter locked up in the cell block. She can't get through because a police vehicle is blocking the way, so we help her move the thing and get through. Ada immediately fucking bolts toward the cell block and just leaves Leon behind. She'll do this a lot, actually. It won't be the last time. When we locate Ben, Ada tells him that she's looking for her boyfriend, who goes by the name John. Ben, the reporter, supposedly had some information about the outbreak going on outside. John was working for Umbrella, but disappeared 6 months ago. Ben is playing hard to get and doesn't want to give us any information. He has the key to his own cell, but doesn't want to leave because he figures the cell is probably the safest place for him. He's dead set on staying here, but tells Leon and Ada that there's a sewer entrance in the kennel room. The sewers should have some way out of the city. Ada abandons us once again, and Leon can head into the sewers. Here we go contend with some incredibly large spiders, which did not bother me because I overcame my fear of spiders in the first video of this series. Just kidding, I ran right past them. Through the sewers, we can find some sort of underground structure and a large door that's locked with a strange mechanism that takes chess piece plugs. This is our overall goal, ensuring that we've obtained every plug from the station and using them to open this door. Since we don't quite have all the plugs we need, we have to exit this door, and on the way out, we run into Ada again. The two find a dead end, but a welcoming vent stands above this closed door. Leon boosts Ada into the opening, and she finds herself on the other side. Much like the first game in the series, we will have short sequences where we play our companion character. Though these were used far less frequently in Resident Evil 1, and some of them were even conditional, here they're actually a part of the story, which I feel like is a good change for this game. Those moments in the first game felt great, and playing Rebecca made you feel closer to the character. It was an additional moment that wasn't entirely necessary, but just felt like an extra touch. In Resident Evil 2, it feels necessary to the character's teamwork. As Ada, we can venture through this extra underground section and quickly complete a box puzzle to gain access to a shelf that has a new key, the club key. This will allow us to unlock the final doors in the police station, as we aren't quite done there yet. Interestingly enough, we can also grab some ammo in here, which Ada will toss back through the vent along with the key. While Resident Evil 2 doesn't have multiple endings based on your actions like the first game did, it still includes these very small dynamic moments, which adds some depth to the experience. Ada can't get back through the vent without our help, so she runs off once again. We can now trace our way back through the parking lot and the basement of the station. Since we have the club key, we can get a red card key in one of the rooms and access the weapons storage area. Here we can obviously find a ton of ammunition, but we're also confronted with a choice. There's a submachine gun in one of the back lockers, along with a side pack. The side pack will increase our inventory space by 2 whole slots, which is a massive upgrade. We can actually take both of these items, but when we grab one, Leon remarks that we should leave the other one for Claire. This is important because whatever items we leave here, Claire will be able to pick up when we go to her B story. These items are static, unlike all the ammo and puzzle items in the station. It's a very interesting choice here because leaving something for Claire will make her playthrough a bit easier. We can even leave both items for her if we'd like, or just take both items and leave her with nothing. It's an interesting choice because it makes these two playthroughs actually feel like they're happening at the same time. The first game in the series didn't do much of this. It was effectively a choice between who was doing all the work and what character was captured by Wesker. Resident Evil 2 makes a bit of an effort to make it feel as if Claire and Leon are both running around the mansion at the same time. Upstairs, with the new key in hand, we can find a watchman's diary that notes how the chief of the station was very protective about the clock tower, where we'll find one of the last chess pieces that we need. It also notes how one of the workers, Thomas, had designed a lock for a door around chess because he was so infatuated with the game. We can collect a couple pieces that we need to get the final piece from the clock tower and solve a puzzle in the library. On our way through the library, though, something happens. Leon stops as he hears the sounds of the dead falling in through the windows of the station. This represents a pretty similar mid-game change that the first Resident Evil game makes. In that entry, the game is drastically changed once the hunter enemy is introduced. The mansion is repopulated with stronger, faster foes. We're suddenly forced to contend with a new threat after thinking that we were relatively safe. In Resident Evil 2, we follow the same structure. We move through the station, clearing out rooms as we find them, or if we aren't defeating all of the enemies present in a room, we're at least figuring out how to navigate them. We become comfortable in the space. We're familiar with its layouts. We know which rooms hold enemies and which ones don't. But the game throws us a curveball by repopulating these hallways. These areas are once again dangerous. These paths are closed off, or they at least represent a fear that wasn't there until a few moments ago. Some of this threat can be curved as these windows have automatic shutter systems installed. We can obtain a cord that will allow us to repair one of them and prevent the zombies from infiltrating the station in that area. But this also brings me to another point, back to the fact that Resident Evil 2 has a much different presence of fear than the first game. Pretty early into the game, we realize that Resident Evil 2 is using the extent of the PlayStation to display as many enemies in one room as it can. The game's fixed camera angles are also used very cleverly to make these groups seem more numerous than they really are. The station definitely has a feeling of being far more overrun than the mansion does, because in the mansion, everyone who was there was turned. Here, we technically have an entire city to contend with, and it's the feeling of being up against a population of turned zombies that provides Resident Evil 2 its distinct style over the first game. This intensity, this adversity, this pressure of being up against the odds is what gives the game its flavor. Though I will say that the Hunter was a particularly impactful moment in the first game, and I don't think the second game's version of this works quite as well when you're just pushing more zombies into the station. There are a larger variety of enemies in RE2, and a larger variety of zombies, with even female zombies being introduced this time around. But it just feels like the mutants really changed the game, and putting more zombies in the station just makes the game more intense. It's different, not better or worse. Heading into the clock tower, we can get the last chess piece that we need to unlock the door to the sewers. Sliding down a chute to the basement, we see a cutscene where Ben is being killed by some strange mutation that's broken into his cell. Leon quickly heads over to find Ben mortally wounded. Before he dies, Ben reveals he was trying to figure out who was at the bottom of things, and he implicated the chief in his investigation. He gives us this evidence, multiple pieces of mail from Umbrella researcher William Birkin to the chief of police, Brian Irons. Birkin was informing the chief that the lab at the mansion had been lost due to Wesker's renegade actions. He also told him to keep an eye on the STARS members that were involved and to dispose of them if they got too close to the real answers. The chief was being paid for these efforts, and Birkin was working on something to replace the T-virus that was destroyed in the mansion incident. He called it the G-virus, and Umbrella started to send agents after him to take it away. Ada arrives after we get this information, but she quickly runs away to go look for John at the chemical plant. Leon radios Claire to tell her to meet him in the sewers, our next stop. Before placing the final chess piece in the lock, we get our first boss of the game, the G. This boss is pretty simple because all it does is slowly walk towards us and spawn offspring. It seems to mutate right in front of us though, but it does go down surprisingly quick for a Resident Evil boss. Entering the next area, Leon finds that Ada has already found her way into the sewers. He finally confronts her about running off by herself. Leon wants to protect her, but that can only work if they're on the same team. Ada agrees to follow Leon, and the two make their way into the sewers. Inside one of the control rooms, we can find a fax that listed the dates and times when different officials would arrive to do quality checks on the facility. The chief of maintenance, a chemical transporter, the chief of police, and William Birkin were all making regular visits to this place. We can head downstairs and find another researcher armed with a pistol. She immediately runs away and shoots at Ada, but Leon tries to save her and takes the bullet. Leon is passed out, and we take control of Ada again as she abandons Leon and chases after the researcher. When she tells the researcher who she is, she recognizes the name the same way that we recognize the name. Ada's name was used as a password in Resident Evil because one of the researchers was in a relationship with Ada. The researcher introduces herself as Annette Birkin, the wife of William Birkin, the one responsible for the creation of the T-virus. She tells Ada that her boyfriend is already dead. He was turned into a zombie. She explains that the G-virus was created to synthesize the ultimate bioweapon, and that her husband, William, has already mutated, the same creature that killed Ben in the station. She blames Umbrella for this accident, and we see a flashback to the events that she's referring to. William had completed the G-virus, and armed men swarmed inside to take the virus away from him. They filled him with bullets before taking the sample for themselves, but William kept the virus on his person, injecting himself with it before he died. He completed his transformation and laid waste to the soldiers attacking him. The G-virus gives the mutated the ability to implant embryos in other creatures, creating offspring and spreading the virus even further. The rats in the sewer are what carried the virus into Raccoon City itself. Ada eventually wrests the weapon from Annette's hands, knocking her over the railing before she heads downstairs. Ada is attacked by something before the scene cuts back to Leon, and we're given control again. As Leon, we can head through the sewers that are crawling with genetically mutated spiders and make our way to Ada. We're quickly faced with our second boss fight, a massive alligator. It will crawl down the tunnel and chase us back. We can spend lots of ammunition here trying to defeat this thing, or we can drop a canister towards the end of the tunnel, which the alligator will quickly try to consume. Once it gets its jaws around it, we can shoot the canister and blow the thing up. We can find Ada in the trash room nearby, where Leon gets a quick patch-up from her. She tells Leon that her boyfriend is already dead, and the two head to find a way out of this place. We can find 2 medallions in the sewers that will unlock another path out. The sewer manager's diary will reveal that Chief Irons was a bit more unhinged than even we realized, threatening to shoot the manager at one point. Heading out of the exit in the sewers will take us to an underground tram car. This car will take Leon and Ada to another area of the underground, specifically an Umbrella lab. But before that, they are attacked in the car by the G-monster once again. It seems that we didn't kill it earlier before it mutated again. On the other side of the tram car, we can find an even larger train car on a platform. We need to ride this platform down into the lab to find a real way out. This rabbit hole goes all the way down. After activating the platform, though, the G-monster penetrates the outside of the car and hits Ada. We can head outside for another boss fight with the thing. This time it's mutated even further, barely resembling a human form anymore. Whatever was left of William has been lost far inside the beast that stands before us. The G-monster will slowly stalk us around the platform while we load it full of bullets. It still doesn't quite have the dexterity or abilities to really give us much of a challenge, though. If it does manage to hit us, it does a lot of damage, so we have to stay moving. Heading back inside, Ava will be knocked out and Leon carries her into the Umbrella lab. He lays her down on a bed and promises her that he's going to look for something to treat her wounds. She reveals that she has feelings for Leon, which is strange because they really haven't spent much time together. She honestly just keeps running away from him every chance she gets. The Umbrella Lab is the last area of the game, our final trial in hopefully getting out of this nightmare. Leon navigates through the place, powering up machines and contending with the mutated lickers and plant creatures that have overtaken the lab. We can get a card key which grants us access to some of the rooms and interact with a computer that allows us to register our fingerprint into the system. I have to just quickly note how good this team was at creating computer UIs. Even the short-lived computer in Resident Evil 1 just looks so cool, and that doesn't change with this entry. I mean, just listen to the feedback sounds from typing on this thing. There is technically another boss in this room in the form of a moth, but it's really nothing special. It just shoots projectiles at us, but we can honestly kill it quick enough to never get attacked. The fingerprint registration is pretty much useless for now though, because we actually need 2 people to activate the door that takes the fingerprints. In another small static event, we can complete this during Claire's playthrough. Heading back upstairs, we find Annette breaking down and looking for Ada. She thinks that we're here to take the G-virus from her. She doesn't want to give it up since it represents the last thing that her husband did in this world. She reveals that her background check on Ada uncovered that she is an operative sent here by the agency. What agency? Who are they? Where are they from? Doesn't really matter right now. All we know is that Annette is claiming that Ada is a spy. Her goal here was to get the G-virus. She was only dating John to get information about Umbrella. Leon doesn't believe any of this, and as the facility comes crumbling down, Annette is killed by some falling pipes. Leon grabs the G-virus and heads outside as a self-destruct sequence has begun in the facility. But before he can head to the exit, Ada arrives, clearly not injured anymore. It turns out that Annette was right, and that Ada was here for the G-virus. Ada is then shot by Annette in a last-ditch effort to stop their plans. Leon tries to stop her from falling over the railing, but he can't save her, and she falls to her death. Leon briefly mourns her before heading for the exit. Downstairs, we can head for an elevator that will take us to a train headed for outside of the city, but the G-monster stops us once again. We have one more confrontation with William Birkin, where he fully mutates into his final form, a grotesque amalgamation of spikes, exposed eyes, and flesh. He jumps all over the arena, dashing at us, climbing on top of containers, and jumping directly on our head. But the final shot takes him down, and Leon has just enough time to get out. When Leon gets downstairs, the train is already leaving, and he manages to hop on. Claire has already boarded the train with a small girl. Claire remarks that she still needs to find her brother, Chris, and Leon bids Ada one final goodbye as the credits roll.
Goodbye, Ada.
This isn't nearly the end of the game because we still have many unanswered questions. Who was that little girl? What was Claire doing while Leon was making his way through the station? And most importantly, what happened after the credits rolled? These questions are left unanswered because we haven't played Claire's side of the story yet. Loading our clear save on Claire's side of the game will allow us to play from the beginning and see what she was up to this whole time. The beginning of this playthrough recaps what happened on Leon's side of the story and introduces us to Claire as a character. Claire is driving into Raccoon City on her motorcycle. She wanders into a nearby bar and is attacked by zombies before being saved by Leon. We then see the same sequence from before as the two crash and are separated by an explosion. Claire then similarly runs along the Raccoon City street streets, trying to make her way to the police station. She doesn't end up in Kendo's gun shop, heading into the front side of the police station. She takes the back route and ends up accessing the police station from the roof. Now, we need to talk about the differences between Claire and Leon's routes. There's a lot more differences when it comes to the route that we choose to play first, but we'll talk about that later. The main differences between Leon and Claire's routes are the way in which they reach different situations. Both characters will still do the same things, at least for the bulk of the story. A lot of the puzzles they solve will be the same, but they'll be looking for different items and dealing with different characters. Claire's main companion is not Ada, but a young girl named Sherry. While Resident Evil 2 does make a better effort at making both of these playthroughs distinct and trying to make it more realistic, like these two characters are traveling through the mansion at the same time, there are still many things that don't make sense. This makes it difficult to figure out what exactly the canon story is. We'll deal with this towards the end of this section, but for now, Claire makes her way into the police station. As she does, something happens that drastically changes the gameplay of her side of the story. A helicopter carries a crate of canisters over the building and drops one on top of it. The canister releases some sort of person into the station. The canister is marked T00, but this character's name is Mr. X. Mr. X is some sort of biological weapon, a massive man in a trench coat that is incredibly powerful. He moves slow and stalks our character, delivering big swings with his fist that devastate our health. Mr. X is hard to take down, but it doesn't much matter because Mr. X will not die. If we defeat him, he'll just return later, over and over again. Mr. X is a character that is only present in the B playthrough. No matter whether we choose Leon or Claire first, he always ends up in the B plotline. He's an incredibly powerful foe, and Mr. X greatly ups the intensity of the playthrough. He's honestly probably the best part of Resident Evil 2 and the most iconic part of this game. Having an enemy that effectively cannot be killed and that will sort of chase us throughout the entire game is extremely defeating. It's a constant obstacle that we have to overcome, that we always need to deal with no matter what. Because of this, Mr. X stays in the back of our mind during the entire time we're playing. It is something that I think the remake will do better, but that's mostly due to technical limitations that existed when RE2 was released. Dealing with Mr. X, Claire will head into the station proper, solving similar puzzles to Leon. Claire's end goal is not to get chess plugs in this area, but to get a variety of different blocks that will unlock access to the sewers. Venturing through the station, Claire will meet Leon in the Stars room, where he hands her Chris's diary. They have a similar conversation as before, but when Claire is leaving, she grabs a fax from the fax machine. Chris was contacting internal investigations about Umbrella and the Chief's ties to them. He was told that Irons was being paid by Umbrella and to express caution when dealing with him. They weren't sure whether the G virus existed, but this fax only comes through when we're walking out, so Chris never got it in the first place. As Claire leaves, she sees a young girl being chased by a zombie and heads after her. She seems to disappear, but as Claire solves the puzzles in the station and manages to explode the entrance to a blocked-off room, she finds herself in Chief Irons' office. There's a dead woman laying on the desk, and Irons reveals himself. He tells Claire that the woman is the mayor's daughter and that he failed to save her. He speaks about her death with a kind of ominous disconnection. He's surrounded by taxidermied animals, a pastime of his. He asks to be alone, and we can head into the back room where we find this young girl once again. She tells us her name, Sherry. She says that both of her parents work at the chemical plant. She claims that some large creature is chasing her and runs away again. Chasing after her, the chief has disappeared and left his diary behind. Turns out that he spread confusion among the police to ensure that they didn't put up a fight against the outbreak. And 2 days later, he decided to start hunting down the survivors himself, killing everyone in the station and finally tracking down the mayor's daughter. The chief was clearly unhinged. Something in his mind had cracked at some point, and it wasn't the virus spreading throughout the city. This plays on the trope present in many pieces of zombie media that the humans around the zombies are just as infected without actually carrying a virus. After this, Claire makes it into a separate section of the underground, but a similar thing happens to Leon. Sherry is here, and even though Claire tries to get her to follow her, she rushes off looking for her dad. Just like Ada, we end up controlling Sherry, heading to the other side to look for the club key to toss it back to Claire. It's actually kind of wild controlling Sherry and trying to dodge zombies and feral dogs. Sherry gives the key to Claire and runs off to find another way to get back. Leon then radios in to Claire to tell her that he got access to the back parking lot. With the club key, we can head back into the basement and take any items that Leon left for Claire in the weapons storage. We can then head back into the station and complete the rest of the puzzles we need to. While completing the puzzle for the cog, though, Mr. X straight up smashes through the wall. This actually terrified me the first time it happened. I was shocked, and it's not just because a powerful monster was attacking me, but because the game became less safe. Resident Evil 2 is great at doing this in many different areas. Generally, there are safe rooms in Resident Evil games. These rooms have typewriters where we can save, item boxes where we can store excess equipment, and generally safety. These rooms represent a spot to take a break, to take a breath, and to rest from the chaos. These rooms are not disturbed just quite yet, but something else that generally represents safety are puzzle rooms. It's not exactly easy to solve a puzzle if zombies are running around trying to attack you. This isn't a strict rule, but it's generally followed. When Mr. X breaks through the wall just after we solve a puzzle, it represents a breaking of this agreement, a shattering of this rule. It's no longer followed, it holds no weight, it means nothing. You can be attacked anywhere, and the game is not to be trusted anymore. After leaving the room, Mr. X pulls this attack again and will eventually chase us up to the third level of the station. When we finally get all 3 blocks, we can unlock the entrance to the elevator. Sherry is here at first, but Claire heads down by herself. She's confronted by Irons, who resents Umbrella for destroying his town. He tells Claire about the G-Virus and its capabilities. He also lets her in on the fact that William Birkin was behind it and that Sherry is his daughter. He's then quickly killed by the G-Monster, Birkin himself. As we enter the underground section, we watch Birkin mutate and transform into the monster. He's our first boss fight of Claire's side, and similar to Leon, he slowly walks towards us, and we start blasting him with the grenade launcher, which sends him over the edge pretty quickly. We can run back upstairs to grab Sherry, who follows us downstairs. As the two head forward into the tunnels, though, they spot Mr. X trailing after them. Shortly after this, Sherry is dragged into a nearby tunnel. Claire makes her way through the underground, eventually coming across Leon after he was shot by Annette. He tells Claire about Ada and sends us to find them. We locate Annette pretty quickly, and Claire tells her that her daughter is missing. Before passing out, she tells Claire that Sherry has a sample of the G-Virus. We can pass through this area again and grab the medallions without fighting the giant alligator since it's already been killed by Leon. Claire calls the tram and meets back up with Sherry. Sherry says she hasn't heard of the G-Virus, so Claire lets it go for now. The two then head to the underground lab, but as Claire calls the platform up, Mr. X is back once again, cornering us on a narrow walkway. We take him down once more, use the platform to head down to the lab, and fight the next form of the G-Monster on the way down. Claire tells Sherry to wait here while she looks for her mother. Sherry tells Claire, in all honesty, that she's thankful for her, thankful that she finally has someone in her life to rely on, since her parents have always been absent. This is a point I'd like to praise for a second. Resident Evil 2 does have a few moments of genuine depth and emotion. This is such a heartfelt moment, and while Sherry isn't outright complaining that her parents aren't around, she's actually expressing gratitude. We can still feel that from her. The fact that a child would be so starved for attention and care that even in the most terrifying and chaotic of situations, she would be grateful is a gut punch, in all honesty. This is why I say that Resident Evil 2 is such a step up in terms of story from the first game. While the remake had certain moments like this, they weren't really present in the original. In the lab, we'll deal with slightly different circumstances than Leon. We'll still have to deal with most of the things he did, like fighting the moth and grabbing the key cards, But we'll also get access to different areas like a power sector. We eventually find Annette again, who reveals that the sample of the G-Virus is inside of Sherry's pendant around her neck, which is why she didn't know about it. We can find Sherry in the power section being attacked by Mr. X. She tosses the pendant to Claire, and Mr. X seems to follow it. It seems like he was sent here specifically to find the G-Virus, which is why he's been chasing Sherry this whole time. Claire tosses the sample into the molten fire below, and Mr. X goes after it. This death doesn't last for long as a new mutated form crawls out of the fire. After this, the self-destruct sequence begins and Claire makes a mad rush to get out of the facility before it explodes. On the way, Sherry finds her mother dying on the catwalk. She begs for her daughter's forgiveness before she passes away, and Claire takes the young girl with her. We use the emergency elevator and guide Claire to the train that takes us out of there. Before we activate the power for the train, we have to fight one more boss, the final mutated form of Mr. X. And just like the end of Resident Evil, we are tossed a rocket launcher by a mystery person to fully destroy this thing. Claire rushes back to the car and starts the train as Leon jumps onto the thing at the last second, and these two are reunited. The facility explodes behind them and the game continues on after the cutoff on Leon's side. It seems like the group is home free, but an alert starts on the train, activating a self-destruct sequence on the vehicle as well. Claire heads into the back car to check it out, and a final form of the G-Virus infiltrates. One last mass of flesh, spikes, and exposed eyes to defeat. Much like the others, we basically just blast it full of holes as it withers away. We then get the final ending sequence as Leon and Sherry attempt to shut off the self-destruct sequence. They eventually shut down the train and get out, but blow the train up with the mutated G-Virus inside. The three survivors get a happy ending as Claire claims they still have one more job to do. They need to find Chris, leaving the game open for a sequel story. This is the end of the Leon A route for Resident Evil 2. Before we talk about what Resident Evil 2 does good as a whole, let's quickly talk about the other route, Claire A. If we start the game with Claire, things are very similar but also very different. Starting the game with Claire means that she is the one that enters Kendo's gun shop and heads in the front of the police station. She takes this route through the mansion and meets Branagh before he turns, she fights the alligator, and she doesn't deal with Mr. X. The only thing that really changes based on who plays first or second are the route that they take through the game. Claire will still deal with Sherry, and Leon will still deal with Ada. There are some slight differences in the way that the story is delivered, and some small extra scenes between the two routes, but it's essentially just the placement of events or who experiences them. So which route is actually better? Most people consider playing Claire first and Leon second to be the best way, or the canon route, and I would honestly have to agree. This is mainly because of the pacing of the story. First of all, Leon's story feels like it works much better when he's dealing with Mr. X. It just adds a lot of intensity to his story, being chased down by the massive genetically engineered bioweapon, and Claire's story feels like it works a lot better when it's centered around William Birkin and the G-Virus. It's also worth noting that when playing Claire first, Shelley is actually infected with the G-Virus instead of just carrying it in her pendant. We have to synthesize an antidote to the virus in the final section of the game and administer it to her. It's also kind of the story that the remake would choose to follow instead of the Leon A route. It just works more for the characters and feels like it has much better pacing. But what about Resident Evil 2 as a whole? This game, for the most part, manages to improve on the formula that Resident Evil set out. It introduces more variety in weapons through, well, more weapons, but also weapon upgrades. It's one of those systems that just feels like it should have been there from the start. The story is massively improved, with actual compelling characters that have an impact on the world around them. As much as I like Barry, Chris, Jill, Rebecca, and Wesker, they all just didn't get enough screen time. Of course, we spent the whole game with Chris and Jill, but scenes where they actually spoke were few and far between. Leon should feel a bit one-dimensional. He should just be the face that's there to save people, the guy that's all surface with nothing underneath, but he actually ends up developing developing feelings for Ada, something that ends in total tragedy for him. Claire has substance and motivation from the start. She's tracing this mystery down because she wants to find her brother, which automatically connects her to the audience since we already know Chris. She is validated by her brother's presence in the previous game. Sherry is tied up in the G-Virus and its creation, an automatic connection with her parents, and even becoming infected with the virus in certain routes. And Ada has her own motivations, ones that aren't completely revealed before she falls into a chasm, never to be seen again. Maybe. Overall, Resident Evil 2 is an upgrade for the series. I don't think it's a massive one. The appeal of the first two games are very similar. I think that the boss designs in the first game are probably better overall, but Resident Evil 2 has bosses that are more tonally accurate. Fighting the G-infected monster over and over, watching it mutate across the runtime, watching it get progressively stronger, accurately elevates the threat that the monster presents, and the Tyrant exists as almost the opposite, a consistent threat present throughout the game, a constant chasing enemy that never stops, not until we finally finish it off for good. The story as a whole is paced much better, though you are required to play the game at least twice to see the whole thing, if not 4 times just to see every little thing presented. This is probably the least enticing part of the game, is the required replayability. It's really nice to have such a dynamic system, like changing where Claire and Leon are in different cutscenes based on the way we played the game. That's generally fine if it's not forced upon the player, but we have to do it no matter what. In the N64 version of the game, we can even find different connections to other Resident Evil games. We can find notes from Jill Valentine. We find out that Kendo, the gun shop owner, knew Barry. We find notes from a character that shows up in Resident Evil 3. We can find out what Rebecca Chambers was dealing with after the mansion incident. It also massively widens the story by noting that a mother virus was originally discovered by someone named Oswell E. Spencer, and the research was eventually passed on to Birkin. And while replaying the game does feel mandatory, replaying the game is also heavily encouraged in other ways. We can unlock many weapons like the infinite rocket launcher or the infinite minigun. We can even unlock 2 alternate scenarios, ones that see us controlling a mercenary named Hunk that's mission is to bring the G-Virus to Umbrella. We have to try to avoid zombies and monsters and get picked up by a helicopter. This same scenario can also be played while we control a stick of tofu mascot. I just can't see any way that this game wasn't an insane value for this era. Even though you need to replay the game, replaying the game still feels fun, and there's much more to do on subsequent replays than in the first game. Resident Evil 2 was an incredibly successful follow-up to the first entry, but years later, it would spawn one of the most successful remakes ever. Capcom had been tossing around the idea of a Resident Evil 2 remake since the remake of the first game came out. At the time, though, all efforts were being put on the development of Resident Evil 4, and Mikami didn't want to take people away from that project for a remake. It would take over 10 years before Capcom would return to the idea, and the Resident Evil 2 remake was finally released on January 25th, 2019 for the Sony PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Windows. I won't go through the Resident Evil 2 remake beat by beat, but rather I'll highlight the improvements that it makes to the Resident Evil 2 and talk about the changes that I wasn't as fond of. Resident Evil 2 remake is fantastic, and honestly, its success is probably partially responsible for the flood of remakes that we've seen in the past 5 years or so. Once other companies saw the success that this game generated, both critically and commercially, they realized they could do the same thing with their properties. Obviously, the largest upgrade that the remake makes over the original Resident Evil 2 is in fidelity. Resident Evil 2 Remake is the second game to use Capcom's RE engine, which honestly still looks fantastic to this day and still gets the company a ton of use. Obviously, this is a huge leap for Resident Evil 2 in terms of graphics, a much further leap than even Resident Evil 1 and its remake made. The updated models all look great, and you can even tell that Capcom is trying to show off at the beginning of the game with the truck driver eating a burger, close-ups of the rain, and this gas pump pump. But obviously the game doesn't really look like Resident Evil 2. The team clearly made the decision early on to do away with fixed camera angles, and you know me, I'm a sucker for a good fixed camera angle. And obviously that made sense for the first remake. That game was released in the early 2000s, a time when you could still sell a AAA game with fixed camera angles. By the time 2019 rolled around, that wasn't really the case. I also don't really mind the change overall because even from the beginning, Resident Evil had some action elements to it. The remake doesn't make it a full action game. It still leans on the side of horror, but those third-person camera angles work to make things feel more intense rather than scary. And that's probably the best thing that the remake does, is capture the original game's feeling of intensity. Ammo is very limited, maybe even more than the original game. A gunpowder system is introduced to allow the player to craft their own ammo based on which gunpowders they combine. This system wouldn't really be introduced to the series until Resident Evil 3, but it makes sense here. Even with that though, there's constantly more enemies pouring in from the windows of the building. Instead of just one cutscene where they refresh the halls of the station, zombies can break into the station at any time as we're walking past the windows. We can board the windows off to prevent this from happening, but boards take up space in our inventory. This remake does present a lot of differences from the original though. We don't end up at Kendo's gun shop until later in the game. A lot more of the fantastical creatures like the moths and the spiders have been removed. Some scenes here and there are cut, but genuinely the only negative that I have about this game is that the routes just aren't as impactful. So, like I said before, in the original game, you decide which route you take by choosing which character's story to play first, Leon A or Claire A. This then sets you on a determined route, and you experience that version of the story. Resident Evil 2 kind of has this, but not really. Instead of A and B routes, it has something called Second Run. So if I beat the game with Leon, the ending is cut off just like in the original game, and I unlock Leon's second run. If I play this right now, then it will show what is effectively Leon's B scenario, which really doesn't make much sense because I haven't played Claire's A scenario yet, which is the one that it fits with. I guess it's just a different way to deliver the information, but in some ways it's worse than the first game's system. There's also the fact that Mr. X is now present in both playthroughs no matter what. I understand this change because they heavily changed the way that Mr. X works in the game, so it makes sense that they'd want people to see it and not hide it behind the second playthroughs. But it just makes the character feel less focused and less special. The whole problem with these changes, though, are just the way they make the system feel a lot less dynamic than it was before. We also basically do the same things with both characters throughout the game. They will take slightly different routes throughout the station, but they will effectively solve the same puzzles in both versions of their story. The only thing that changes is the puzzle solutions in Second Run. But again, this is among the very few complaints that I have about the remake. One of the best changes that it does make is Mr. X. In the first game, Mr. X would chase us across different areas, but it was effectively pre-programmed where he would show up. This means that you could get used to his appearance if you played the game a few times. He was a static event, and even though it didn't feel like it the first time, he eventually could be predicted. This is not the case in Resident Evil 2 Remake. Mr. X is far less predictable. He chases us throughout the station, a constant presence behind us, bearing down on our existence in this space. Just like in the first game, we can deal enough damage to him to stun him briefly, but he'll be back again no matter what. And this is a feeling that's carried across the entire project. Intensity is the name of the game. It genuinely feels like we're surviving, begging for the next moment that we can take a breath, and barely getting by, hanging by a thread. Most everything in this remake is done well. The game looks gorgeous, even the little details like the animations that show object interactions when we use them. The fidelity is increased, but the atmosphere is special too. Dark hallways and narrow corridors. Shadows are used masterfully in the remake to make you fear the dark. Light is subtly used to communicate to the player that they need not fear here. The shooting is incredible, the game feels fantastic to play, and just like the first game, replayability is at an all-time high. The game rewards you with extra weapons for completing it quickly or getting high ranks. One of my favorite features of this entry are the extra scenarios that the game includes. It isn't just the fourth survivor scenario that was included in the original game. Of course, that's still present here, but we can also play a scenario where Kendo, who takes his own life in this version of the game, actually survives and manages to escape the chaos of Raccoon City. We can even play the mayor's daughter, imagining a scenario where she manages to escape the chief's clutches and get away. I'd also like to note that this version of the game does pay more attention to the side stories. Ada and Sherry's sections feel far more distinct than they did in the original. Sherry actually has her own section now where she's trying to escape the chief as he chases her down. There's this terrifying sequence where he's crashing through a kid's playroom as we have to sneak around and avoid his gaze. At the end of the day, the remake is better than the original in my opinion. It isn't quite as good as the remake of the first game, but like I said in the last video, that might be one of the best survival horror games that I've ever played, so it's a pretty high bar to match. The Resident Evil 2 remake is certainly fantastic though, and while I don't agree with some of its changes, I can't debate the fact that it is an intense, beautiful, and incredibly fun survival horror game. Like I said before, Resident Evil 2 Remake was an incredibly successful project for Capcom. It currently has a 91 out of 100 on Metacritic for the PlayStation 4 version of the game. The game sold 4 million copies within its first month of release. In just 3 years, it had sold over 10 million units. The game would spawn many other Resident Evil remakes and would send the series into a new era of success and popularity. Resident Evil 2 is a good sequel, but what should a good sequel do? This is a point of contention, and that answer was very different in the 90s. Today, it seems sequels always need to build everything from the ground up, to reinvent the wheel and start from scratch. But Resident Evil 2 doesn't really try to do that. Despite its flawed production, the sequel is quite an efficient game. It actually seems to reuse some animations and items from the first game. The crank is present in RE2, and the cranking sound seems to be the exact same one from the first game. The spiders don't seem to have been changed at all, and I doubt that many animations for shooting pistols were adjusted all that much. Resident Evil 2 very much feels like a game on the same framework as the first one. The upgrades that this game makes when compared to the first game are not massive. They are slight and subtle. Weapon upgrades, new environments, and the expansion of enemy varieties and enemy amounts are among the few. This doesn't make Resident Evil 2 an entirely new experience, completely built from the ground up. It's still made on the same hardware, assumingly with the same engine. It's just an attempt at making a new story within that framework and pushing things a little bit further, seeing what the team could do within these constraints, and it seems like they could clearly do a lot. Resident Evil 2, while probably not the best game in the Resident Evil series, is a masterfully done sequel. It knows where it stands, it knows the flaws of the game that came before it, and its motivation is just to improve in the small areas that it can. If there's one thing that Resident Evil 2 and its remake have in common though, it's that they were both smash hits for Capcom. The original game was rated highly by most outlets, with Resident Evil 2 achieving an 89 out of 100 score on Metacritic. It was the fastest selling video game in North America, and after just over a month, the game had sold 3 million copies. It managed to outdo the bar for success that the first game had set up, which meant that this series was not just around for a good time, but a very, very long time. The studio would quickly follow up with another sequel and would begin its era of producing many spin-offs, but we'll talk about that next time. Bye, Dad.